But we want to welcome you to our second annual All Saints webinar. Last year we had a great conversation which included Susie Henderson, who's back with us this year. No doubt every one of us on this webinar tonight has recently lost someone beloved to them, or is in the process, or is close to someone who is in the process. And we can only salve that wound with memory, but we North Americans are notoriously poor at particularly at historical memory, at the art of remembering. The dominant culture into which we are all socialized and deformed is a culture that is rife with historical amnesia, of course, and disconnection from the past, even from our personal and family pasts. This has had a huge negative impact on personal, family, and community practices of mindfulness and memory. So we have a lot to learn from cultures for whom rituals of remembering are more intact. One of those cultural traditions, however, is right at the heart of our own Christian tradition, and that is the Ecclesial Feast of All Saints. So just as a reminder, it's actually a 3-day feast, beginning with Halloween, coming up on Thursday, which is short for All Hallows Eve. Hallowed, of course, is the Old English word for holy ones. And as in the Jewish tradition, Christian feasts start the evening before the day. So Halloween is the eve of All Saints' Day. It is to All Saints' Day what Christmas Eve is to Christmas. All Saints is the great high feast of the church. And it is followed by All Souls' Day, which was a later feast which was included to honor all of the departed. So this essentially offers us a 3-day period to celebrate and mourn those who have passed over, both famous and forgotten, both personal and public. We've here in our work, and I know it's true also for many of you, we are slowly but surely learning how to observe what we call this All Saints Triduum in our lives for a lot of the reasons that we're going to talk about tonight. Now, last year at this time, we hosted our first All Saints webinar, which looked in some detail at a lot of the details of this tradition and its many cultural expressions today, and we commend that webinar to you. It's available to view on archive. You have the URL on your slide screen on the lower left and also in your notes box in the upper right of your screen. And we want to commend that webinar to you. That was a great discussion. Tonight we're going to keep exploring practices that might help us resist and renew our secularized North American culture, steeped as it is in a denial of death and dying. And this is a culture that is all the more murderous because of that denial. So let's begin tonight by citing these very famous lines from the Epistle to the Hebrews. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, and let that be a preface to the call to resist, even unto a death, the powers of death, as it is in the book of Hebrews.
So it's only appropriate to do a brief litany of remembrance as the invocation to tonight's conversation. So we want to name a few of those who have borne witness and then passed on before us. For example, this last Sunday was the 44th anniversary of the first experiment in public liturgy as civil disobedience. Catholic priest Philip Berrigan, artist David Eberhardt, and United Church of Christ minister James Mengel entered the draft board at the U.S. Customs House and poured blood on several hundred draft records. The Baltimore Four, as they became known, were arrested and later tried and convicted for this action. This was the inauguration of a tradition of anti-war symbolic acts of nonviolent resistance against the machinery of war. This experiment led to the Catonsville 9 action, pray-ins at nuclear weapons facilities, and later the Plowshares movement. It is also important to us because Philip Berrigan, who passed away in 2002, and that story is told in Laurel's book, Phil was a personal mentor to many of us. All Saints' Day, November 1st, is also the anniversary of when Susan B. Anthony and her 3 sisters entered a voter registration office that was set up in a barber shop. They were part of a group of 50 women Anthony had organized to register in her hometown of Rochester, New York. Anthony walked directly to the election inspectors and demanded that they be registered. The inspectors refused, but she persisted, quoting the 14th Amendment's citizenship provision and the article from the New York Constitution pertaining to voting, which contained no sex qualification. Inspectors voted to allow Anthony, her 3 sisters, and 11 other Rochester women to successfully register that day. And this was perhaps the start of the modern women's suffrage movement. A few years ago, our friends at Spiritus Christi Church, a Catholic parish in exile because of its ordination of women, discovered that the site of Anthony's historic action was an empty lot in town, all but forgotten by the citizens of Rochester. So they bought the lot and several surrounding blocks and built dozens of units of low-income housing. And as the cornerstone of this project, on the very site of Anthony's action, they built a beautiful cafe called the 1872, which now hosts cultural and political events. Chad visited that cafe last year and told me it is magnificent. Meanwhile, the city, shamed into remembering, installed a monument to Susan B. next door. Spiritus has witnessed to history and to the city in this wonderful project. And the list of historical events goes on. All Souls Day in 1972, 500 protesters from the Trail of Broken Treaties, a Native American march, occupied the Bureau of Indian Affairs offices in Washington, D.C. for 6 days. Their goal was to gain support from the general public for a policy of self-determination for American Indians. It was a major watershed of Native activism and the spiritual foreparent of contemporary movements such as Idle No More and Moccasins on the Ground. And finally, we do not want to forget the very day of commemoration and our at the beloved community center in Greensboro, North Carolina. November 3rd is the painful anniversary of a Klan massacre of 5 labor organizers, and this story is also in Laurel's book. Out of this tragedy came the Greensboro Truth and Community Reconciliation Project, the first truth and reconciliation in U.S. history. So on Sunday, our friends at the BCC will gather to remember their friends as they always do, and our hearts will be with them. So this sets a little bit of tone and context for our focus tonight. Our guest is Laurel Dykstra, a priest in the Anglican Church, a dear longtime friend and colleague. Laurel got her start in the Catholic worker movement. Then she did a degree in Hebrew Bible at the Episcopal Divinity School in Boston. And today, Laurel works as a pastor and an activist in inner city Vancouver, her home place, where she is the mom to 2 beautiful, almost teenage girls. Laurel is also a movement theologian. She's widely known for her great 2002 study of Exodus entitled Set Them Free, The Other Side of Exodus.
And the link to that book is up in your discussion notes page. So if you're not already familiar with that book, we want to urge you to check it out. We've had the honor of collaborating with Laurel on a number of projects, nor is this book, Bury the Dead, her first effort to edit an anthology, which, believe me, is a huge amount of work. Laurel has worked with us on getting the Center and Library for the Bible and Social Justice up and running up in New York State, and in the process, she wrangled an anthology called Liberating Biblical Study. Again, the link for that book is up in your notes page. It's a magnificent effort that we had the opportunity to work on together, and she really honed the art of getting very widely diverse people to write reflective pieces on a theme. A lot of work, and we are really grateful now that she has taken those skills and applied them to the theme of tonight. Tonight, our focus is her newest book, which is called Bury the Dead, Stories of Death and Dying, Resistance and Discipleship. It's published by Wipf Stock. Here on the slide, you see a screenshot of the Wipf Stock page. Twice during this webinar, I'm going to plug you to buy this book if you don't already have it. Here's how you go to the page. The URL is also in the notes page. We really want this book to spread around in the movement because it is in itself so much of a reflection of the movement. So, Laurel, welcome. We're so pleased to have you, and I believe that you want to start out tonight with a story that's dear to your heart.
Yeah, so I will begin and say thank you for that great and kind of embarrassing introduction. It is lovely to see so many names that folks that I've been with at different actions and different events sort of scrolling up the screen. So hi and welcome to all. I took part in a remarkable trip just a couple of months ago up the Fraser Valley to sites that are historic for the Chinese Canadian community, sites along both the railway lines along the Fraser River and also sites connected to the mining industry. And the history of British Columbia and the import of Chinese labor and the use of head tax to control Chinese migration was such that in a couple of enormous waves, large numbers of Chinese men came to live in British Columbia to work the railway, and again in several mining industries. What happened was that as jobs finished, people were abandoned where they were. If workers fell sick, they were abandoned at various sites along the railway line. And so the not super well-known history is that there's this huge connection along the Fraser Valley between the Chinese men and First Nations communities that took them in. And so some places along the Fraser Valley and along the railway lines, there are communities that estimate that somewhere between a fifth and a third of their community members have some Chinese ancestry. And so I had the good fortune to visit an unmarked grave on First Nations land, on interior Salish territory, that for decades the First Nation there had been tending the graves of Chinese workers, simply as a service, not as a relationship to people that they knew, but as a means of care for someone else's dead, which is sort of a remarkable story of an enacting of the biblical call and the work of mercy to to bury the dead and to care for the dead. And my experience since working on this anthology is that people have teased me a little bit, saying, you know, this is a book that wrote itself, because there's been a really high level of and a high desire to tell stories like these. And what I'm finding is more and more people continue to come to me when they hear that I'm working on this project, or when I mention a little bit about what I'm doing, with stories that they're incredibly eager to tell and haven't got any other place to tell. And I think that's a symptom of kind of the failure of our culture, that it both promotes death and denies it. The book itself, go Ted. You look like
Well,
you were going to ask an
I
interview.
wanted to invite you to. Yeah, I wanted to invite you to go deeper now into the origins of the book itself, which, as you've told it, have a lot to do with the Word and World movement, which you've been part of for many years. And there's a whole array of contributors who come from that movement. You want to talk a little bit about the roots of this book in the Word and World mentoring program of a couple of years ago?
Well, yes, I do. So the real spark or impetus from my perspective of this book was when I was part of the Word and World mentorship program, this pretty remarkable program that pairs up more experienced activists with young Christian activists, mostly in their 20s, for a year of dedicated study and project and schooling in both the literature of movement, but also in kind of the skills and community of movement. One of the folks that I was paired up with was the lovely and remarkable Lydia, Wylie, Kellerman. We were on a mentorship phone call, and we're both struggling to do some writing. Lydia writing about care for her mother, the luminous Jeannie Wylie, talking about her long illness with brain cancer and how a community of care worked to keep her in her home and in her family as she was dying. And I was struggling to write about some women in my neighborhood, really who I felt at the time were haunting me. Women who had died in a neighborhood where a whole lot of First Nations women die. And as we were kind of struggling with our writing and not getting very far, and you know, me being less of a mentor and more of a commiserator, I realized after the conversation that we in fact had this huge network through a number of Christian justice movements that were all kinds of folks were already doing this work, and that we had people that we could draw on and gain support with and have these conversations with, that we didn't have to sort of do it in pods of isolation. So I put out a call, an email shout out, and said, if we did some kind of project about this, if we were to pull together a bunch of stories, who would be interested? Within 48 hours, I had 6 people who had agreed to write and 2 sample chapters. So the desire to tell stories about our beloved dead is so unmet, and people respond so readily. So that's the Word and World connection, and a number of the contributors have connections to that movement of sanctuary and street and seminary. That's the other one.
These are some of the other contributors. So it was both a Word and World inspired project, but also well beyond that in some of these other kindred circles, eh?
very much. Yeah, and so it's a funny thing that it's both, it's kind of movement history through this lens of care for the dying and resistance to the culture of death around us.
Would you say, Laurel, that our habits and practices in social justice, faith-based social justice circles are very developed around death and dying, or do you feel like that's kind of a frontier now of maturity in some of our circles?
That's a tough question. That's actually a question that I would put to some of the more, I feel like I have fallen into this work. I think that persistently, movement-wise, we have been connected through practice and through the writings of people like Bill Stringfellow to the acknowledgement of death around us. But I think that real reflection on it and a deeper out kind of engagement with that is developing. So, but I would put that question again to kind of more experienced members of the movement, because in some quarters it's most developed and in some less.
Well,
I'm gonna keep thinking about it.
one of the practices that does obviously come up in this book is the great tradition of building altars to remember the dead, and the of course Dia de los Muertos is part of the All Saints Triduum. It's a well-developed tradition here in Mexico and the American Southwest, but in many ways it is spread much more broadly. Reflect a little bit about how that is addressed in the book, that tradition, and how you've encountered it.
A couple of different contributors talk about the tradition of the way that they have celebrated the Day of the Dead, Dia de los Muertos. If the Mary on the line is Mary Bradford, her article, she's a hospice social worker, and she writes with love and care about preparations of her own altar for family members and beloved who have passed. And the way, it's kind of a lovely interaction, because the other contributor who talks about this a fair amount is Bill Wylie Kellerman. His article pairs with Lydia's, as they both write. One is the partner to Jeannie's passing, and where Lydia is the daughter, and they have these beautiful companion pieces that kind of cornerstone the book. So Bill refers to the Day of the Dead, and it's quite a neat coming together, because Mary very much from the social work and from the medical tradition of hospice and care for the dying, in that developing compassionate tradition out of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and out of that English hospice woman whose name is escaping me at the moment. Susie, can you chime in with her name?
Say a little more.
Uh-oh. I'll see if I can find it quick. Anyways, so Mary comes from the professional model, and Bill's is very much from the home-based, community-based, and some green burial movement approach to care for the dying at home. And those are really, their articles are really in dialogue with one another, because there are shared aims and there are in some ways competing aims, and so to get to hear both of those perspectives is quite remarkable.
Looks like Cheryl has typed in Dame Cicely Saunders of the St. Christopher's Hospice movement in England.
Thank you, Cheryl. I couldn't read the book at the same time as I was calling for her name.
In many ways, Laurel, you talk about the process of writing this book um, as a deeply pastoral one because of the huge hunger there is out there among folk to be doing this work. What else can you say about that hunger and about pastoral responses of what it means to be a community of faith in the midst of this, particularly people who are working on the edges of church? Obviously, churches have traditionally buried the dead. That's one of the last remaining roles for a sort of culture church, and yet to recover this practice in radical communities has been hugely healing and enervating. Do you want to say more about that?
Couple of things that I would say. One is that I'm an activist and a scholar writer because I suck at the pastoral. And when I did my theological education, the pastoral courses were the ones that I avoided most avidly. So coming to this work that has this huge pastoral aspect to it is entirely daunting to me. As we're doing publicity for this project, I feel like I know the movement people, and I feel like I know the activism people, and that what I know about the pastoral end is much more limited. Bill Wylie Kellerman in his article talks about sort of stumbling into, in seeking a community of support. He's a rock star of pastoral work. But stumbling into this whole of what he calls sort of serial intensive pastoral care, that while they were caring for Jeannie at home, different members of the extended community would come and offer pastoral care for the family and come and stay for a few days and then go away again. And the process of working on the book was kind of that process again. I had the experience of coming to do this. I was writing about Fern and Lori and the women in my neighborhood, in part because I wanted to sort of exercise some of that grief, that I wanted to let go of it. And so instead I ended up editing a book that was a collection of everybody else's grief. And so instead of like getting to put down my story that was weighing me down, then I was like picking up all of these other stories. But the model of care continued and does continue, and I think that's what we're getting better at, or maybe just that's what I'm getting better at. Having started, having started this work. I see Tim's put up wonderful photo. This is Priscilla Mays, is the woman in the hat with the tassels, and I can't remember the name of the woman who's next to her. This is the Women's Memorial March that happens every Valentine's Day in my neighborhood. The downtown east side of Vancouver is internationally one of the centers of what they call femicide. It is a place where there's been a high number of murder of women. And particularly in Canada, the estimates of numbers for missing and murdered Indigenous women kind of start around 600 and go up from there. So this is a place where we remember women in our neighborhood. And maybe I'll take, if it seems like a good time, the stories that I was struggling to write were about women in my neighborhood who had died. And maybe I will find an excerpt to read from that passage if it seems like a good time.
Great.
It's called Love Letters to the Dead, Not Worth Saving. So I'll read a little bit from the preamble, and then the article goes on and is addressed to each of a number of folks that have died that I've known. I started to do the math. Since 1992, when I first moved to the Catholic Worker, I've prayed at more than 100 street funerals, memorials and vigils. Sat on cold metal folding chairs in cheap funeral homes, community centers, and the common rooms of single-room occupancy hotels, in groups as large as 200 or as small as 3, to remember the lives and mark the passing of society's least loved. Alcoholics, homeless veterans, sex offenders, crack dealers, junkies, transgender sex workers, thieves, cripples, schizophrenics, scabbed and bad-smelling, who died by suicide, overdose, murder, and disease, none by old age. Where I live, people die so young you're eligible for seniors programs at age 45. I go to these memorials because I can, because I live a little bit distant from the relentless rising numbers of the dead. I'm closer to certain than many of my neighbors that the next funeral won't be mine. I pass a friend on the street and ask, "Are you going to Johnny's service?" The answer comes back, "Can't go to those things. I hate funerals. There's just too many." And really, 100's not so many in 20 years, if you're a hospice worker or an oncologist. But I'm not. I've gone from being a volunteer to a service provider, community organizer, and now I'm just a neighbor. I'm not even a very friendly neighbor. And each funeral was a face that I knew. I've forgotten so many. And a name, even if it was a street name. Dollar Bill, Cowboy, Dee Dee. And as we sit and listen or pray, I'm repulsed by the funeral urge, mine and other preachers, to talk about these problem dead as babies, as once somebody's child, as if their adult lives needed to be erased and negated, as if they need to be reduced to something big-eyed, blunt, and helpless to remind others of their worth and value. Well, they were valuable as they fucking were. Hurt, damaged, dangerous, surviving, living. Sometimes I can go months without getting a call, seeing a poster on a lamppost. But when I worked at the drugs user group, the drop-in center, there were months when I heard about a new death every day. During one of those months, I was talking to a minister of a nice middle-class church, a friend. I told him about 3 women I knew from the neighborhood who died. "So you're grieving?" he asked. I heard that word and it was like a cartoon light bulb over my head, or an explosion. I wanted to take the word in my hand. It's not just how I feel or what's happening this month. Grieving is the word that defines me, maybe for a lot of years now. My role as this silent bystander on some horrible parade to the grave is grieving. That is the work that I do, for people who are not grieved elsewhere. I pray for the dead, not worth saving. So some other folks wrote chapters as well.
Thank you for that, Laurel. In the tradition of grieving, there's also this tradition. Say a little bit about the great tradition of jazz funerals out of New Orleans.
So these are some excellent photos that go with an article written by Jordan Flaherty, who, I don't know if folks know Jordan's work. He lives in New Orleans. He was one of the journalists who first broke the Jenna 6 story and has been super active in documenting resistance traditions in racialized communities in New Orleans. He's got a fantastic little piece about the role of jazz funerals as a means of reclaiming the street. Traditionally, and historically, this was the procession from the funeral home, from the church to the graveyard. And bands and mourners and community of support would come out. And, these have morphed into essentially a celebration each weekend that's hosted by different neighborhoods and community sections in New Orleans. For folks who couldn't have burial insurance, who couldn't afford the sort of middle class means and white means of care for their dead and dying, to celebrate the lives of those who have passed. And Flaherty does a really good job of talking about how these celebrations are demonstrations of a community's civil right to exist, and that the way that people take the streets joyfully in the name of those who have died really kind of echoes the Day of the Dead celebration in the way that it's public, in the way that more celebration aren't separated, and also in the way that they are maligned racially, in the way that they're considered less legitimate forms of expression and mourning. And he does an excellent job of sort of making some comparisons and unpacking some of the pejorative ways in popular culture that we look at the way that racialized communities, that we look at the way communities where young men are often living in poverty and at risk of violence are memorialized. And so the physical and ceremonial markers that we publicly have for those who have died are also an echoing story in the various contributions to this volume.
Coming up next month will be the annual School of the Americas protest, and that's been another way of politicizing, memorializing, another sort of expression of public liturgy. Talk about how this comes up in the book.
Let's see. In this book, we have an article by, I'm just looking for a quote here, and I may or may not find it. Anyways, we have an article by Pablo Ruiz, who, during the Pinochet era, I think you're losing the video on me, was a political prisoner who has recently worked for School of the Americas Watch, and he talks about the cry of presente, the statement that began at, in his accounting, that it began at the funeral of Pablo Neruda, this call to name those who have died, those who are martyrs to social violence, as present with us. And that repeated call, that that statement that those who have passed are present and support and guide and undergird our work, has launched this specific North American resistance movement, but has been part of Latin American resistance traditions for a long time. The way that the book is set up, the first half of the book is very much stories of home-based hospice and stories that focus around the loss of a particular, the loss and care for a particular loved individual. And the stories in the second half of the book are more focused on resistance and the loss of greater numbers. And the temptation is to say, well, this is the personal end of the story, and this is the political end of the book. I think another way that I would think of it is that that in the sort of the classic Mother Jones quote, that at the beginning, in the first stories, we mourn for the dead, and in the other stories, we fight like hell for the living. And what I think is great about the anthology is the way that those stories really do weave together. And so it closes with this fantastic speech from Frida Berrigan talking about the life of her father, Phil, and what it means to carry on this tradition of a peaceful warrior. At the same time, this wasn't a lecture that she gave in a classroom or a sermon that she gave in a church, but a speech that she gave in Zuccotti Park at the heart of the Occupy movement. And so the way those personal and political care blend together is also kind of the heart of the volume, I think.
Speaking of the personal and the political, just as you were completing the editing of this book, your own mother fell seriously, and you didn't know what was going to happen with that. Do you want to talk about that as part of the process for yourself?
Yeah, so this very weekend is an anniversary for me. I came home from a church meeting late in the evening on All Souls Night to a message that my mother was in the hospital in another town, a ferry boat or a plane ride away, after all of those things have stopped running at night, but with no indication as to why or what was going on. She was diagnosed with a advanced and aggressive ovarian cancer. And sort of in the middle of all of this editing, in the middle of carrying all these stories of grief, to be able to call on that assembled community of care and that pastoral network was a pretty remarkable resource. As my family was crashing around, trying to get to where we needed to be, trying to sort out a whole lot of things that we hadn't thought about. And the happy news is that a year out, she is doing remarkably well, and is really proud of the book.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I want to just ask Elaine for a minute. Family stories are important, and this mural that we painted at our home as part of a ritual of renaming our home after her great-grandmother was one example of trying to tell the story of the cloud of witnesses. Do you want to say a word about that?
Yeah. Laurel, I appreciated your words of saying that those who have passed on, those who have gone before us, they're present, and they guide us, and they undergird the work that we are doing. And I certainly feel that about the ancestors of my family. I'm right now doing some studies around trying to tell their stories, honoring those stories, and they're difficult, painful stories. And so one of the real gifts in our life is this artist, Dmitry Kadyev, was with us in July 2012 and painted a triptych. You're seeing really just one piece of it, and in actually it's pretty early stages. It's amazing the detail that has gone in, that went into this mural. But it has been such a gift to me to have this huge mural. How many feet is it? It takes up a huge concrete wall right in our, when you open the front door, that's what you see. There are my ancestors on the wall. And what it affords me is the ability to tell people the story of their lives. And they survived a very violent time, Russian Revolution and the Civil War, and on all four of my grandparents and many Mennonites have this story. There are stories of courage and nonviolence and faithfulness and hospitality to enemies or those who would do harm to you. And so for me, I know that I carry these stories in my bones, both the incredible stories of faith and ecstasy on one hand, and then also the deep trauma that they endured. And I think that all of us carry stories, whether we have these ancestors are actually in our blood or the claimed people who we claim as our spiritual ancestors. We carry these stories, and for me to have this mural painted on our wall is one of the ways that we honor my ancestors and the stories that come out of my community, and it allows me to tell this story to all the guests that come through our place, because nobody can miss this mural. It's pretty big.
One of the things that we did in the wake of the hospice experience that we write about in your book, Laurel, was after LaDon passed, we did a number of memorial services around the country because there were so many people who had not had a chance to say goodbye to him. And everywhere we went, we were amazed at how people just wanted to clear space to mourn, and LaDon was the initial focal point, but then grief called to grief, and suddenly they were mourning family members and friends, and that hunger to tell the story is something we have experienced over and over again. You experienced it in the writing of this book. This book will in turn invoke more of that in the movement. That is such a healing thing. Why do you think our culture both denies and promotes death? That's just such a weird dialectic. You talk about it a little bit in this book.
I think because it works. I think that the way that Stringfellow talks about being captive to the power of death, I think that Lydia does a fantastic job, and you do a fantastic job in the section from Who Will Roll Away the Stone, where unpacking the way that being kept from grief and being kept from the reality of death around us prevents us from resisting, silences and numbs us and enables us to do more harm and to be party to more harm because we don't know what we're doing.
Mm, mhm, mhm.
I
We
think
have, go ahead.
I was going to say those larger questions about kind of the pervasiveness and deathliness of the culture around us are addressed really well both by Liz Nicholas, who writes about, essentially, she writes about how Audre Lorde and William Stringfellow and reading them saved her from suicide. That that the words that allowed her to face the deathliness, especially as a young Black woman, of the culture around her, that the culture surrounding her directed at her through individuals and relationships, um, that only through reading their words was she able to sort of incisively cut through that and see how she was faced with death and also be called to life. And I think that the resistance is a key theme to the book. I think the other theme to the book that you clearly state, that Lydia says so clearly, that Liz also says very clearly, that Murphy Davis, that Kieran Prather in their descriptions of what's really key and what really matters, and they both speak from the perspective of illness. And when you're reduced, who are you and what is your value? Only when we face death that the possibility of encountering resurrection is real. I think Jeff Dietrich also is really clear on that, and I think that I think, why does the culture do it? Why does the culture keep us from telling that truth and facing that reality? Because it works, because the culture is one of death and not of resurrection.
Mm. Mm. We have a great privilege of having somebody who I think is as good a dialogue partner for this book as we could ask for. Susie Henderson is currently in seminary in Toronto and is pioneering a path to try to shape her theological education precisely around the lost arts of midwifing dying, another way of embracing the dying process in order to resist the culture of death. Susie, you've been listening here now for a while, and I know you've read this magnificent volume. I want to open it up to see, first of all, what questions you have for Laurel. And thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yep.
The first thing I want to say to you, Laurel, is thank you for this book. I think that as I read it, I found the stories themselves were powerful, but the collection of them is really powerful and speaks a whole story to me. And that's, I think, the part of it that I find the most significant, in the sense that you have contextualized stories of death and dying and grief in that bigger story of social movements and resistance to death in our culture. And that's not the way stories are usually told, and that's not the container that we usually find them in. And so that in itself, it just feels really relevant and significant. So thank you for that. As someone who is looking to put some of this together myself, I found that really helpful. And as you were talking, I find myself really doubting that you suck at pastoral care. And I think that at least in my own experience of pastoral care related to grief and death, that pastoral care sucks. at least in its official capacity. And as I'm trying to study it, I find that constantly it's framed in this Western psychology model that's all about letting go and all about restoring ourselves to kind of individuals and wholeness after a loss, that really rooted in that model of instead of remembering, so that any kind of focused engagement around death or any kind of prolonged remembering is pretty soon characterized as pathological and unhealthy, and people get all freaked out about that. And it seems as pastoral care providers, we kind of soak that stuff up really uncritically, and it's a real parallel stream. So I find the ground that you've laid really quite fresh, and the thing about that is because it invites connections, you know. So you're inviting people, and you hear it in the stories that you've collected. People are moving back and forth between struggles of Israel-Palestine, or you know, work on the Lower East Side of Vancouver, or in the nonviolence movement, and all of that is mixed into the stories. And I just found that really rich as a way of inviting connection. And so I wonder, you said a little bit about that, but I wonder how intentional was that on your part? Or, I mean, you also worked with what people brought to you, but I really admire that you didn't kind of put all that stuff as the political pieces and just keep the, you know, the pastoral parts. Like, was that a struggle that you had in the editing?
Two responses to that. One is I think that the story of Ladan Sheets is sort of the clearest example of that kind of miraculous way that those two worlds are so the same to me, and it may well be. I think the question that I put out to folks that were interested in writing was specifically around how do we care for the dying? How do we resist the culture of death around us? So I think there was some intentionality in it. And some of the submissions, because in some ways the collection feels kind of ragged to me. It feels, because I see all the pieces that are missing. There were a number of people who, for various reasons, weren't ready and able to tell their stories. And so I see the you know, kind of the civil rights movement story whole, and I see the prison justice narrative that's missing, and well, Murphy Davis's beautiful piece carries some of that. There are pieces that I see missing, and there were submissions that came that I thought, you know, this is more different than everything else. Particularly the submissions from some of the younger women of color. And I thought, you know, is this part of this anthology? And I think what's good about it is that even though some of those connections would have been clearer if the missing pieces weren't there, that it very much is sort of a first overture. It's let's start having these conversations, and so to see. And to see that all of the resonances and the way that the stories do bounce off of one another, and the way that you know, that Ched's piece on Mark resonates with Eda Oka's piece on the wasps and you know, colonialism and genocide in the Exodus story. I don't think that was an answer.
No, I think it does invite connection in it, and I think it invites us to reflect on how that experience of colonialism has also impacts our practice of pastoral care, you know, because I do think we have commodified that, and we give it away and we take it out of people's hands, and so I think that that is a big connection. The other connection that I really liked, it's in the story right at the early Tom Carlin around coffin building, and the way
That was where I was going next.
he talks about the dignity of the work that he does, and I found that when he talked about that work, the physical craft, and how that is, you know, it involves people, it's something to do, but it also creates an opportunity to make an offering at the time of death, which is kind of what we want to do. You know, I think that it creates the right moment for people to give something, whatever that is. And I really liked the way he talked about that work. And it kind of reminds me that as much as I think people want to tell the story, that our hands are kind of itchy for something to do, and yet we don't know what to do anymore. I started to write down a list of all the people you talk about who are involved in these, and I don't even have anything near comprehensive, but you talked about partners and sisters and a clearness committee, or these are people in the stories. Activists, carpenters, housemates, 20 Latina women who arrived to sit vigil, people who own vans and trucks, cooks, people who can dig, people who can clean house, some people who pray with words and some people who pray with their jets, firekeepers, gardeners, a couple of clergy, some people who can make banners. Like the list of people, of actual practical things that people are doing is really, I thought, a great way to think about how do we enable this work and how do we kind of take it back in our hands and help people put it back in their own hands. So I love how the stories just give so many examples of that.
Tom Carlin is also really good about talking about the sort of the problem of outsourcing. That we've outsourced the care of children, and we've outsourced the care of elders, and so of course we've outsourced the care of the dying and the care of bodies of our loved ones. And I think that the tasks end of it was underscored for me when I was indexing the book, because often I would come to a heading, and when you do an index, they want you to index nouns. And so I would come to a subject heading, and really, like I would talk about prisons and the prison industrial complex, but then I would realize that the bulk of the entries were about prisoners. And I would talk about hospitals, and I would talk and realize that the bulk of those entries, or a significant proportion of them, were about hospital workers. And that, you know, much as I don't like the pastoral stuff, it kept coming back to people.
Yeah, and stories, yeah.
Susie, you have you've been trying to shape a program at the seminary to reflect on precisely the crisis of outsourcing and how we can bring death and dying not just into the church as the last ritual, but into the practices of the church as people whose hands and feet are itching to do things. Are you finding that that's an uphill battle at the seminary? Are you finding your way? Are you finding openness?
Well, in theory, there's openness, but what I'm finding is there really isn't a lot of opportunity to learn this work, which is, I mean, the way is becoming clear to me that we need to learn this shoulder to shoulder, you know, that I've just recently switched from the pastoral care to the social ministry stream because I can't really absorb one more ounce of the pastoral care program, I find. But I believe that there's opportunities to learn from, for example, Jewish and Muslim communities who've kept this practice that's rooted in faith, right? They care as communities for the bodies of people that die, and kind of give leadership to those processes in ways that we have left behind. And so I'm hoping for my integrative paper to do a little bit of work in those communities and just talk to the people who do that work, and how do they learn it, and what does it mean to them, and what do they do, and just really some of the hands-on folks learn and teach their children to do, and have designated communities to do that. Because I think that what I find is there's such a reluctance in our own communities for people to engage. I was sharing with you earlier that I did this shrouding project for my worship class. Everybody had to work on a project, and so people were doing all kinds of things, including pet funerals. And I suggested that we work on a liturgy to shroud somebody who's died. Well, nobody wanted to work with me, except finally one Unitarian guy agreed to do it with me. Nobody would be the person who we shrouded. So it was up until the last moment of our presentation that somebody actually agreed to lay on the table and pretend to be dead. So we just kind of kept moving on. And after we did it, though, and we did a simple ceremony of just inviting people to make an offering of lavender or cedar or some words or some water, and then wrap the body in a linen shroud, and then carry her to her coffin. After we did it, people said, wow, that was really cool. I can imagine doing that now. But it was really something that there was a whole lot of anxiety about when we suggested it. And I feel like constantly that's what we're facing when it's like the question is, how do we bring people closer in to do this? Because there's certainly a lot of resistance to that we're inheriting. So that's my question.
Yeah, in our experience of hospice, we really experienced that these practices, these ancient practices of burying the dead, are in our bones, but not at our hands. Yeah. Because so everything we did, none of us had ever done before, whether it was digging a grave, researching the legalities of burial, anointing a body, all of those things, none of us had ever done. But intuitively, they made sense, because we were very clear that we would not outsource this. And I'd like to hear each of you reflect on that cultural, spiritual dilemma, that this, on one hand, is deep in our bones as human beings, but culturally not at our hands.
Well, I heard a funeral director recently talk about her role in interpreting to families what their traditions are. So she said people are coming to her without knowing, second generation people in Canada, who, without knowing what their cultural practice is, and just saying, well, we want to just do something simple, nothing too fancy. And she kind of raises the question of, when all their aunties and uncles come to the funeral, they're going to expect something different than what you're planning. And so she then goes on to educate them about, what their particular practice is. But it's all very superficial, at one level. And I'm thinking, at one hand, thank goodness there is someone having this conversation, but really, is that where we are? That, at the time of death and making those arrangements is when someone's kind of giving you the handout of, this is how you have a Greek funeral in Toronto. Like the teaching and the practice, I think, really does need to start with our children. And by bringing them, to ceremonies, and by creating some of them when we feel like we're kind of making it up as we go along, but also we are able to draw down deep on some of what's happened in the movement when Christians were known for burying the dead. So what happened to that?
Laurel, thoughts?
I don't
I
think I
think the
have a,
story of those
I don't think I
neglected.
have a better,
Go
I
ahead,
don't
Laurel.
think I have a better answer than that. But I did want to respond to Cheryl's question in the chat. I was looking for a sentence to transcribe. She's asked, how does hospice care fit into the perspective onto Susie and my perspectives on privatizing grief and death care. And my experience with hospice is pretty limited, and so I feel like I don't have a good answer. I think Bill Wylie Kellerman has an excellent line. He says, from the perspective of Jeannie's deathbed, I would say that a hospice program best supports and enables a real hospice community to gather around. So I think complementary.
I think that it is one of the most places currently in our society where you get a possibly well-attended death, in hospice care. But I still think people leave too soon, more often than not. And you still have the tendency for that to become professionally occupied space.
Yeah.
Especially now when people are at home in highly medicalized situations, So there's still, I think, a backing away from the actual death itself and the time immediately after death to make some meaning around that. Although I think hospice care is better than a lot of other situations, but it has also that, at least the hospice that I'm familiar with, grew up from actually my own congregation and now became an independent organization with the board of directors, that I sat on for about 6 months and went, okay, no, this is not the place, this isn't where this work came from. And at the same time, they do incredible work and meet an incredible need. But it still is professionally occupied space for the most part. And I think they do some of the education in terms of what can happen at home and what, the people, for example, can keep people at home after they've died, or you can claim a body from somewhere after it's died. Sometimes the only place to get that information is from hospice care. In my program at the Institute for Traditional Medicine, there was a fellow from New York who was involved in a very big hospice there, and they'd just done an audit of their services and found that when they asked people about the actual experience at the time of death, that although they were reluctant to say anything bad about hospice because they received wonderful care, there were lots and lots of stories of how at the moment of death, things kind of fell short of what they had hoped. So either they let people continue to sleep through the death, or the bodies kind of were rushed away afterwards, or people didn't really know what to do. And so in response to that, this fellow has set up now an actual volunteer program of people who support the active dying process, and they kind of do a vigiling thing with families right around the time of death and right after, to fill in this gap that they found in their own experience, which I thought was very interesting, and I suspect is maybe common. But
I was just going to jump in. Chad and I have only had one experience with hospice, and that story is in the book of Laurel's. Oh, our experience was beautiful with hospice. They came by very occasionally, and I did a lot of research on green burials, so we knew what we needed to do and what was within our legal rights. And I cannot quite remember. I know we recorded the time of death, and we were with LaDon's body. We kept his body the entire time. I'd figured out it was hilarious trying to get enough dry ice to keep LaDon's body cool so that all the relatives could get there. And then even just talking about the skill set for a minute, we couldn't figure out how we were going to lower LaDon's body into the grave. But we were just amazed at the people that showed up at hospice. About 100 people came through during the 4 months we were with LaDawn, and one of them was a woman who made hammocks. And so we were talking about how are we going to lower LaDawn's body, and she said, I will make a hammock for you. And so we had, the amazing people that came through with their skill set at the time that we were trying to problem solve was really a wonderful gift to us. But the hospice people, I just felt they absolutely supported us and got out of the way. And they did come by on the day we called them after LaDawn had been, I believe, dead for a number of hours. And they came by and took, their things and left because it was very clear how we were going to care for LaDawn's body until he was buried. And so that it was a wonderful experience. The thing that was the hardest, I think, for us was the drug management in terms of keeping LaDawn comfortable, but not giving him too much. And again, the hospice person was very helpful in kind of helping us struggle through what that looked like.
Mm-hmm.
I want
Elaine
to
talks about
before you just hold that thought, Laurel. Before you respond, I just want to invite participants on the webinar to type in questions. We're sort of now in that phase where if you've got a question for Susie or Laurel, please type it in, and we'll do our best to try to address these. Go ahead, Laurel.
I was going to say that Elaine talks about, at least I think it was Elaine's voice in the writing as I did a little source criticism on your article that the two of you did together. It came up on with Susie's photo, and it came up in Mary Bradford's article and a number of the other contributions, the phrase midwives to the dying. And I think that if we look at a parallel to birth, I think that the place where we've lost so many skills and the place where we feel most at the loss is immediately after, like as we were talking about, like once the person has died, then the midwife's care is most critical. And so I think that kind of language offers us a really helpful parallel to think about where do we seek for skills, where do we apply the skills that we have, how do communities do and talk about that care, and also like where are sort of the nexus points where structures and professions step up or step back, take over, or let us take over.
Mm-hmm.
I want to just note Marcia Dunnigan's comment. Marcia's a dear friend who is a home health care professional, and she recognizes that there's constraints as long as, whether it's a hospice program run by the county or a hospital-based program, there are constraints. And I know people like Marcia, have great bedside manner and do everything they can to cooperate with people who have a vision. But of course, often people don't have a vision for how they want to do this. Susie, you've looked at a lot of the literature around midwifing of death or the so-called death doula movement. Are you encouraged by the trends that you see?
Yeah, I feel like there is an emergent movement, at least here in Toronto. There certainly is a more developed movement in the United States. Now, a lot of that I think has developed in kind of resistance to the funeral industry, right, with Jessica Mitford and the American Way of Death. And I think that the Canadian folks who, at least that I'm encountering, mostly through the Institute for Traditional Medicine here in Toronto, which is largely a circle of Buddhist folk, includes some funeral directors and some hospice workers and some nurses and quite a mix of people. But what we're starting to look at next in a couple of weeks is how do we gather together as a community of praxis together. So instead of, I think some folks may organize along the midwifery model and begin to look to that model of the Ontario midwives as how they organize themselves into now a licensed profession, to do something similar in relationship to death and dying. And others of us are more interested, I think, in how do we engage communities in this work and kind of just help people in general take it back as the work, that happens in homes and in churches and in communities, and not necessarily in a professionalized way. I think those things go together nicely, and I'm glad that conversation has both components right now, at least with the folks who are meeting in Toronto, which I think will be I'm expecting about 60 people in a couple of weeks. I don't know if there's more than that, but it's the first meeting of its kind that way, and has had connections with a lot of folks in the United States involved in a whole variety of types of movements like hospice, and there's a woman in California, Jerry Grace Lyons, who's doing a lot of home-based funeral. She calls herself a home funeral guide. So what I find is there certainly are not many mainline or any kind of line Christian folk there. Like,
she's excited about the book.
Yeah, like there's a few people who have religious parents in my class, also are kind of familiar with some of the Christian language and context, but there's really like an absence, I find, in the churches that I'm familiar with of any of this sense of movement or reclaiming. It's really about planning, a memorial service long after the body has disappeared. So that certainly is the trend in the United Church where I'm familiar now.
And a lot of my instruction as a clergy person around funeral prep is very much is really focused on sort of time management and making sure that people's grief is very contained, and that expressions of it take a certain amount of time, and a whole lot of things that are neither pastoral nor care.
Mm-hmm.
As in so many things, the church has been deeply complicit with the professionalization and outsourcing of the dying process, and yet the church is really still well positioned to be part of the resistance and renewal around these things as well. Sounds like several of our audience have some experience with the home funeral movement. I do want to note the time. It's 7:15. I'm keenly aware that for those of you in the Eastern time zone, it's late, but because we started late, I'm going to say that we'll go for another 12 or 13 minutes. We'll go to the bottom of the hour. And if you can hang with us, please do, because we're really on holy ground here. We're talking about very, very important things. This is the perfect week to be talking about these things. Laurel, you mentioned the environmental impact of all these things. There's a chapter on green burial, right, in the book?
Your chapter refers some to green burial. Tom talks a little bit about green burial movement. One of the holes in the book is the instructions for coffin building, but there's not a specific article that only refers to green burial. But the overlap with that movement is also another area where I'm like, who knew this world was out here? And that folks are coming to it from a number of perspectives, and I think meeting resistance from both industry and faith communities.
Now, one thing that neither of you have talked much about tonight, and I don't want to wind to a close without at least broaching it a little bit, is how has this process, Laurel, and you're writing the book, and Susie, in your trying to prepare yourself around these practices, how has it changed your theology? How's it impacted your theology?
You couldn't have told us you were going to ask this before, right?
Well, you're both theologians, so I know you've thought about it.
I'm waiting for you to go first.
I thought your lips were moving, so I was waiting for you.
Well, I want to say that I think you, Ched, have been the most challenging to me because I've been looking for this story. I hadn't really found it in the churches, in terms of this work. And you were the one who said to me, to challenge me to kind of look within our own tradition and to dig up our ancient practice. And so through school, I've had the opportunity to try and do that a little bit more and look at early Christian burial practice or the Jewish understanding of ancestry and land and how that's connected to who's buried in the land. And so I think you knew that was in there, and I'm finding there's a richness there that I hadn't learned. And so I think this has actually brought me closer to my own faith and story, and it still leaves me wrestling with, the ecclesial part of the church, and how I live out this calling is not clear to me, or if it even is a calling. But certainly, just in terms of my own faith and story, I feel like the Christian story holds this in a way that I think is very powerful and invites us into it. So it's certainly richer for me. But that's because I found some of that through you and through this connection, not because I found it anywhere, in the mainstream channels. So thank you for that.
Laurel, we know that burying the dead is certainly considered one of the mercy, but what really are the theological underpinnings of this vocation that you have so beautifully mapped in this book?
So, really, I'm not a theologian at all. Really, I'm a Bible geek. And so I think I came to do this work from the biblical premise that repeatedly there are stories of caring for the dead that are acts of resistance, that are overtly acts of resistance. And so through the collecting of stories, the way that those things are true, the way that memorial T-shirts in urban First Nation communities are an expression of that the lives of the loved matter. Against a culture that says every day and every way that they don't, is made concrete and real. So I think my biblical theology doesn't change, but has a whole lot more, lived praxis that informs it and underlines it and amplifies it. And so when I read the lives of my community and the stories of my community with Scripture, that connection, that assertion that when we care for the dead, whether we do it at home, whether we do it in the public sphere, that those are absolutely connected and that they are absolutely about resistance.
I want to give each of you a chance to think of your closing words that you want to say. And while you're doing that, I want to, for the second time, underline to everybody on the webinar that this book is available. It's a magnificent map, conversation continuer of something that simply could not be more important. And this is a good week to go out and get this book and read it, even in personal meditation, as we move through the great All Saints Triduum. It's available from Wipf Stock. Support the publisher. Don't go the easy way to Amazon. Support the author. Laurel also is going to be helping lead a retreat with the Good Word and World folk in Seattle this weekend around these very same themes. So Laurel, we wish you all the best. I know that there are folks coming from all the way down here up to join you. So I know that will be a really sacred gathering. But everybody's homework on this webinar is to make sure to get a copy of this book and to get it in circulation, to get this conversation going. I also want to remind everybody that our next webinar is just in a few weeks, Tuesday, November 12th. We're going to be looking at some of the highlights of our recent Bartimaeus Institute a few weeks ago, where we looked at watershed discipleship as a new paradigm for eco-theology and practice. So we hope that you can join us there. All right, I've got the two of you a little bit of time. Susie, I'm going to invite you to go first. Just any last thing that you might want to say to folk before we sign off.
I think that our work together is the work of remembering. And I was just reading the World Association of Christian Communicators, unfortunately called WAC, who are talking about the power of remembering, or the right to memory, the right to public memory, related to the Institute for the Museum for Human Rights in Chile, where people are, writing all the names of people killed in the Pinochet regime on a wall, and talking about that as a public right, I think, is a huge piece of work to do together. Whether that's putting up ghost bikes in our own communities when cyclists die, or remembering those in our communities, where I think that our Christian practice of creating litanies and rituals and vigils that do that, make that meaning together, is a really significant thing to offer into that way of remembering in public space and in private space. So thanks for the opportunity to do some of that tonight.
And thank you for joining us and for your own good work. You are really pioneering this for all of us, as are you, Laurel. Thank you for this wonderful work. There's so much in it that we didn't cover, but I hope folks got a taste of the many, many dimensions of this great anthology. And so I turn it over to you, dear sister, for the last words.
So the last words are another story that was gifted to me in the process of this. As I sent out publicity about the book, a young woman, Kat Cohorst, who I know as an environmental activist here in Vancouver, working especially on the issue of pipelines, emailed me a poem about her brother who was a murder victim, and her longing for all of the kinds of things that we've been talking about here. It's called Compost. We could have put him in the ground, straight into the dirt under the monster oak tree. He would long since be food for the worms, converted into the roots, the water, now the leaves and the acorn. Next year the squirrel steals the acorn, stashes it in a tree a mile away. Leo is spread throughout the earth, soaring on milkweed fluff, sneezed out the nostril of a deer, burrowed into the sand of the sea, perched observing my life from the far reaches of the universe. Perhaps every flea and every grand beast is composed of the pieces of our lost beloveds. Him derived from some other, from Grandfather Leo, from Aunt Mary, from Matty the dog, and now pieces of him in me. I see him in the mirror, in the pattern of my teeth, and in the curve of my father's ragged toes. And there are chunks of him pouring from my mother's broken heart. And she, gathering those spilled pieces, collecting, preserving. Compost.
Mm.